Welcome to 4 hours of Hollow Knight lore, where we'll unravel every mystery of Hallownest from the ancient worm's sacrifice to the Radiance's final stand. So get comfortable, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's descend into the kingdom below. There's something haunting about Hollow Knight that goes beyond its beautiful, hand-drawn art and challenging gameplay, because beneath the surface of this dying kingdom lies one of gaming's most intricate and tragic stories ever told, where every character, every location, every enemy has a purpose in a narrative that spans thousands of years. And tonight we're going to explore all of it together as we journey through the ruins of what was once the greatest civilization the world had ever known, and discover why it fell and what horrors still lurk in its depths, waiting to be awakened. The worm's transformation. Long before Hallownest existed, before there were kingdoms or cities or even the concept of civilization itself, there was a creature of immense power wandering the wastelands beyond the kingdom's future borders, and this creature was known as a worm, one of the higher beings that possessed intelligence far beyond mortal comprehension and the ability to grant sapience to lesser creatures through unknown means. The worm travelled across barren lands, where only the most primitive insects survived on instinct, alone scavenging and hunting, without thought or purpose or dreams, and for reasons we may never fully understand. This particular worm decided that this would not do, that these creatures deserved more than their base existence, but to grant them the gift of consciousness, to elevate them from their savage state, the worm would have to sacrifice everything it was, because higher beings operate on principles beyond our understanding, following rules and limitations that seem almost divine in nature. So the worm found a place that would become the heart of a kingdom, and there it performed an act of transformation so complete that it essentially died, shedding its massive form and being reborn as something smaller, something that could walk among the insects it wished to uplift, and this new form took the name Pale King. The Pale King was no ordinary vessel for the worm's consciousness, because he emerged with not just intelligence, but purpose and vision, and an almost obsessive need to create order from chaos, to build something eternal that would stand against the natural decay of all things. Where the worm's massive corpse fell in the lands that would become the kingdom's edge, the shell remained as a landmark and a reminder of what had been sacrificed, though few would ever know the full truth of what lay in those ancient caverns. The birth of Hallownest. With his transformation complete, the Pale King set about his grand design, and the first step was establishing his presence as a ruler, because you cannot build a kingdom without subjects who recognize your authority and believe in your vision. He attracted insects from far and wide with his power, because the Pale King possessed something that made him irresistible to the mindless bugs that populated the land, which was the ability to grant them consciousness, to awaken their minds and give them identity and will. Imagine what that must have felt like for those first insects to suddenly be aware, to realize they existed as individuals, with thoughts and desires and fears going from pure instinct to full sapience. In a moment, would be both terrifying and miraculous. The Pale King's light, his pale presence, drew them like moths to a flame, though that metaphor is perhaps more ominous than it first appears, given what we'll learn about light and infection later in this story. As more insects gathered, the Pale King found a partner in his vision, a queen who would rule beside him, and her name was the White Lady, a creature who some believe was also a higher being, or perhaps something that became one through her connection to the Pale King himself. The White Lady possessed her own unique powers, tied to growth and life itself, and together they would become the monarchs of what would be called Hallownest, a kingdom built in massive caverns beneath the surface world, where stone and crystal and ancient magic would form the foundation of insect civilization. The Pale King established his palace at the very heart of the kingdom, in an area known as the White Palace, where reality itself seemed to bend to his will, where saw blades and spike traps and impossible architecture existed in a space that may have been partially separated from normal reality, existing in a fold of the world, accessible only through specific means. The great cities rise. Under the Pale King's rule, Hallownest flourished beyond anything the world had seen, because suddenly you had insects who could think and plan and build, working together with purpose, creating structures that defied their small statures. The City of Tears became the crown jewel of the kingdom, a massive underground metropolis where rain fell eternally from cavern ceilings, where carved stone channels carried water through streets, lit by lumafly lanterns, and where the wealthy and powerful built their estates. Imagine walking those streets at the height of the kingdom's power, when every building was occupied, when the sounds of commerce and conversation echoed through the blue-tinted districts, when the soul sanctum stood as a place of research rather than the house of horrors it would become. The city wasn't built in a day, of course, and throughout the kingdom, other settlements emerged, each serving a purpose in the grand design that the Pale King had envisioned for his realm. There were the mining operations where workers extracted the precious pale ore that seemed to hold properties connected to the king himself, where they dug ever deeper into the earth, uncovering ancient ruins and forgotten places that predated even the worm's arrival. The Mantis village developed as a separate society within the kingdom's borders because the Mantis tribe, while they acknowledged the Pale King's power and agreed to a truce, maintained their own culture and hierarchy and way of life based on honour and combat prowess. They became the guardians of certain deep places, particularly the area known as Deepnest, acting as a living barrier between civilized Hallownest and the horrors that bred in those pitch-black tunnels where more primitive and predatory instincts still ruled. The Moth tribe's betrayal. But we need to step back and understand something crucial about how the Pale King's rise to power affected the balance of the world, because he wasn't the only higher being with influence over the insects of this land. Before the Pale King, before Hallownest, before civilization, there was another being of immense power whose influence held sway over the moths and perhaps other creatures as well. And this being was known as the Radiance. The Radiance was a creature of light, of dreams, of a power that connected to insects on a level even more fundamental than consciousness, because she existed in the dream realm, the space where sleeping minds wander, and where memories and desires take on a life of their own. The Moth tribe worshipped the Radiance as their god, and through this worship, through their devotion and their dreams, they maintained a connection to her that gave their lives meaning in the way that only religious faith can provide. But when the Pale King arrived with his gift of higher thinking, with his promise of civilization and progress, the moths faced a choice between their old god and this new power that offered them so much. One by one, the moths turned away from the Radiance, abandoning their worship, abandoning the old ways, embracing the Pale King's vision, and joining the society he was building in Hallownest's depths. The Radiance felt this betrayal, as higher beings seem to exist in a way that makes them dependent on the worship and acknowledgement of lesser creatures. And as the moths forgot her, as they sealed away their old temples and let their memories of her fade, she began to diminish. The Pale King may have encouraged this forgetting, because he understood that his kingdom could not thrive with divided loyalties, that the moths needed to fully commit to Hallownest for his grand design to work. So the Radiance was forgotten deliberately, erased from history and memory, until she became less than a myth, until she was nothing but a faint, uncomfortable feeling in the back of the mind, like the sensation of being watched by something you can't quite see. The infection's first whispers. But you cannot truly kill a higher being, especially not one tied to dreams and memory and light, because the Radiance did not simply disappear into nothingness when the moths turned away from her. Instead, she festered in the dream realm, growing angry, growing desperate, finding that her power, while diminished, was not gone, because some small part of every insect's mind still connected to that dream space where she dwelt. The Pale King's gift of consciousness came with an unexpected vulnerability, because minds that can think can also dream, and minds that dream can be reached by something that exists in dreams. The radiance began to push back against the, forgetting to send out pulses of her presence into the sleeping minds of Hallownest citizens, and at first these were probably nothing more than strange dreams, uncomfortable visions that insects would wake from, feeling unsettled but unable to remember why. But the radiance grew stronger as she focused her remaining power, as she pushed harder against the barriers that the Pale King's influence and the moth's forgetting had created around her. The first real signs of trouble came when insects began to exhibit strange behaviors, losing themselves to instincts that civilization had supposedly tamed, becoming aggressive or confused or standing in place, staring at nothing as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. The Pale King and his scholars quickly identified this as a threat, and they called it the infection, because it spread like a disease from one insect to another, though they may not have immediately understood what was causing it, or realized that they were facing the vengeance of a forgotten god. Orange pustules began to appear on infected insects, their eyes glowing with a sickly light as their bodies filled with some kind of luminous substance that seemed to override their will and replace their personality with something else, something angry and hostile. The Pale King's desperate research faced with a threat to everything he had built, the Pale King threw all his resources into understanding and stopping the infection, because this wasn't just a disease. This was an existential crisis that could undo his entire civilization. He gathered the greatest minds in the kingdom, researchers and scholars, and those who understood the deeper mysteries of soul and void and consciousness itself, and set them to work discovering the source of this plague. The Soul Sanctum became a centre of this research, where a sorcerer, who would later be known as the Soul Master, conducted increasingly unethical experiments, trying to understand the nature of soul itself, the life force that animated all living things. The Soul Master believed that by harvesting and concentrating soul, he could achieve immortality, could transcend the limitations of his mortal form, and perhaps find a way to combat the infection through sheer magical power. His experiments grew more twisted as time went on, as the pressure to find a solution mounted, and he began using living subjects, draining them of their soul in agonizing procedures that left nothing but empty husks behind. Meanwhile, the Pale King pursued his own line of research because he had come to understand something terrible about the infection's true nature, that it wasn't a disease at all, but rather the influence of the radiance bleeding through from the dream realm, trying to reassert her dominion over the insects who had forgotten her. He realized that the infection couldn't be cured in the traditional sense, because you can't cure someone of being influenced by a god. You have to either eliminate the god or seal it away completely, cutting off its ability to reach into the waking world. The Pale King knew he couldn't destroy the radiance, because higher beings cannot easily kill each other, especially when one exists primarily in the dream realm where physical laws don't apply in the same way. The Vessel Plan. So the Pale King conceived of a plan so ambitious and so morally horrifying that it stands as perhaps the greatest tragedy in all of Hallownest's history, and this plan required creating a being that could contain the radiance, like a living prison. The radiance existed in dreams and spread through thoughts, so the Pale King needed a vessel with no mind to be infected, no will to be controlled, no voice to cry suffering, because only something completely empty could contain something as powerful and persistent as a vengeful god. But how do you create a being without thoughts or feelings or consciousness, when the Pale King's entire purpose had been to grant consciousness to mindless creatures? The answer lay in the void, an ancient primordial darkness that existed in the deepest places of the world, far below even the lowest caverns of Hallownest, in a place called the Abyss. The void was the opposite of everything the Pale King represented, because where he was light and order and consciousness, the void was darkness and chaos and the complete absence of thought or purpose. It was a substance and a force that predated Hallownest, that had always been there in the deep places, and the Pale King in his research had discovered that it could be shaped, that it could be given form if you knew how to manipulate it properly. Working with the White Lady, the Pale King began a process of creating vessels by combining his own essence with the void, allowing his offspring to be born, but ensuring that the void would consume any consciousness or will or emotion that tried to form within them. The White Lady bore thousands of these eggs, and from each egg hatched a creature that looked like a small insect with a black shell and a face that was just a mask with no features except for hollow eyes that revealed only darkness within. These were the vessels, and the Pale King's plan was to find one that was truly perfectly empty, with no mind, no will, no voice that could then be raised and trained and filled with soul, until it was powerful enough to have the radiance sealed inside it. The Hollow Knight. Chosen. The vessels were left in the abyss after hatching because the Pale King needed to test them to see which, if any, were truly empty, and the test was simple. They would have to climb out of the darkness to ascend toward the light at the top of the abyss. Most of the vessels failed immediately, consumed by the void, or unable to muster even the basic instinct to climb, but some tried to make the ascent, scrambling over each other in the darkness, reaching for something they couldn't understand. At the top of the abyss, the Pale King waited, watching for the vessel that would succeed and watching to ensure that it showed no signs of thought or emotion or will during its climb, because any hint of personality would disqualify it from serving as the prison for the radiance. One vessel made it to the top, pulling itself up from the depths and standing before the Pale King in silence and stillness, and the king examined it carefully, looking for any sign of imperfection. The vessel showed nothing, no response to stimulus, no interest in its surroundings, just an empty shell, animated by some basic force, but containing no self, no identity, no soul in the metaphysical sense. The Pale King declared this vessel to be hollow, to be perfect for his purpose, and he took it from the abyss back to the White Palace, where it would be trained and prepared for its ultimate purpose. This vessel would become known as the Hollow Knight, and it would be raised as the kingdom's champion, taught to wield a nail, trained in combat, given access to soul, until it became incredibly powerful. The Pale King treated the Hollow Knight with something that might have looked like fatherly affection, though whether he truly felt anything for this creation, or whether it was all part of the plan to ensure the vessel's proper development, remains unclear. Throughout the kingdom, the Hollow Knight became a figure of hope and legend, a silent warrior who served the king and protected the realm, and none except the king himself, and perhaps the White Lady, knew what true purpose this knight would serve. The sealing ritual. When the time came when the infection spread had become critical, and the Radiance's influence threatened to overwhelm Hallownest entirely, the Pale King enacted his plan's final phase. The Hollow Knight was brought to an ancient place called the Temple of the Black Egg, where three powerful creatures, called Dreamers, would perform their part in the sealing, because the vessel alone wasn't enough to contain the radiance forever. The Dreamers were insects who had volunteered or been chosen to enter an eternal sleep, a living death, where their consciousness would act as magical seals, binding the Hollow Knight in place so the radiance could never escape. These three were Lurian the Watcher, who oversaw the City of Tears from his spire; Monomon, the Teacher, who preserved knowledge in the archive; and Hera the Beast, who ruled over the spiders of Deep Nest and who extracted a terrible price for her cooperation. Hera agreed to become a dreamer on one condition, that the Pale King would grant her a child, because she needed an heir to rule Deep Nest after she entered her eternal slumber. The Pale King agreed to this bargain, and the result was Hornet, a child who was both part spider from her mother's heritage and part higher being from her father's, essence making her unique in all of Hallownest. With the dreamers in position, the ritual began, and the Hollow Knight faced the radiance in the dream realm in a confrontation that we can only imagine, but which must have been spectacular as the higher being of light tried to assert her power while the empty vessel worked to draw her consciousness into itself. Through means we don't fully understand, the Hollow Knight succeeded in containing the radiance, pulling her presence into the hollow space where thoughts should be creating a prison of void and emptiness that even a god couldn't escape. The Hollow Knight was then sealed in the temple of the Black Egg, bound by chains of magic, and wrapped in barriers that the three sleeping dreamers maintained through their eternal vigil. The temple's massive door was sealed shut, meant never to be opened again, and the people of Hallownest were told that their kingdom had been saved, that the infection would trouble them no more. Hallownest's golden age. For a time the plan worked, and Hallownest enjoyed what must have been a golden age, where the fear and chaos of the infection faded into memory and life returned to normal. The City of Tears thrived with merchants and artists and scholars filling its streets, while the Soul Sanctum continued its research into the mysteries of magic and consciousness, though with slightly less urgency than before. In Deepnest, Hornet grew under the guidance of the spider weavers, learning to fight with needle and thread, mastering the abilities she had inherited from both her parents, becoming a protector of the kingdom's darkest region. The Mantis tribe continued their honoured role as guardians of the deep places, maintaining their traditions and occasionally allowing worthy outsiders to test themselves in combat against the Mantis lords. In the fungal wastes where mushroom creatures formed their own strange society, life continued in its peculiar way, with the mantises keeping watch to ensure nothing dangerous emerged from Deepnest to threaten the surface areas. The royal retainers served the Pale King in his palace, carrying out his will and maintaining order throughout the kingdom, while the king himself seemed to believe that his plan had succeeded, that he had saved his kingdom. But there was a problem festering at the heart of everything, because the Pale King's plan had been based on a flawed assumption that the vessel he had chosen was truly hollow, without any mind or will or emotion. The Hollow Knight had seemed perfect during testing, had shown no signs of consciousness or personality, but that was because it had been suppressing these things, because even as a newborn vessel climbing out of the abyss, it had felt something. When the Hollow Knight reached the top of the abyss, and the Pale King turned to leave, one other vessel had almost made it to the top, a smaller vessel that reached out as if asking not to be left behind in the darkness. The Hollow Knight had looked back, had hesitated for just a moment, and in that hesitation, in that simple act of looking back at another, it had demonstrated something that should have disqualified it from serving as the prison for the Radiance, which was the capacity for emotion, for attachment, for an idea, however primitive, of something beyond itself. The flaw. Within, the Pale King either didn't notice this moment or chose to ignore it, pressing forward with his plan, because he had no other option, because finding another perfect vessel might take decades or centuries that Hallownest didn't have. So the Hollow Knight was sealed with this tiny flaw within it, this microscopic crack in the emptiness that was supposed to make it a perfect container, and at first this flaw meant nothing. But over years, over decades, perhaps over centuries, as the Hollow Knight stood bound in chains, in the darkness of the temple, holding the Radiance's essence within itself, that tiny crack began to grow. An idea of self began to form in the space where there should have been nothing, because the Hollow Knight had experienced. Things had been trained and raised and had formed, if not memories, then something like impressions of existence beyond the void. This growing consciousness gave the Radiance something to grip onto, like a seed finding purchase in a crack in stone. She began to push against the Hollow Knight's will, to whisper in the space where thoughts were forming. The Hollow Knight tried to resist, tried to maintain its emptiness, tried to be what the Pale King had needed it to be, but consciousness, once it begins to form, is nearly impossible to suppress completely. The The radiance grew stronger within the Hollow Knight's mind, her light seeping through the cracks, her influence beginning to leak out into the dream realm, and from there into the sleeping minds of Hallownest's citizens once again. The kingdom's decline. The infection returned slowly at first, so gradually that many probably thought the early cases were isolated incidents unrelated to the plague that had supposedly been sealed away forever. But the Pale King knew, or at least suspected, what was happening, because he would have felt the radiance's influence growing, could probably sense that his plan was failing, that the seal wouldn't hold. He retreated deeper into his palace, into his studies, perhaps trying to find another solution, perhaps simply unable to face the fact that his greatest achievement had been built on a foundation that was fundamentally flawed. The White Lady withdrew to her gardens in the deepest parts of the kingdom, binding herself with roots, as if trying to contain her own power, or perhaps punishing herself for her part in creating the vessels and the Hollow Knight and the whole tragic plan. Throughout Hallownest, people began to notice that something was wrong, that some of their neighbours were behaving strangely, that the old fears about the infection were suddenly relevant again. The Soul Master in his sanctum became more desperate and more twisted in his experiments, because he had dedicated his entire existence to achieving immortality, and the return of the infection meant that his time might be running out. He pushed his research into increasingly dark territory, draining more subjects, accumulating vast quantities of soul, until he transformed himself into something bloated and monstrous, believing he had achieved his goal of transcendence. In truth, he had become a slave to his obsession, a creature that could barely be called an insect anymore, just a hungry thing that existed only to consume more soul in a futile attempt to fill an emptiness that would never be satisfied. The kingdom falls. Silent. As the infection spread more widely, as more and more insects fell under the radiance's influence, the social structure of Hallownest began to collapse, because civilization requires minds that can think and plan and cooperate. Infected insects became violent and hostile, attacking anything that moved or standing in place, swaying gently, as if listening to music only they could hear. The City of Tears began to empty as residents fled or succumbed to the infection, with entire districts becoming ghost towns, where the only movement was the sway of infected husks. The merchants closed their shops. The Soul Sanctum's experiments ended in disaster, as the Soul Master lost control completely, and the whole structure became a tomb filled with the corpses and ghosts of his victims. Lurien remained in his spire, maintaining his seal as a dreamer, unable to wake even as the city he had watched over for so long fell into ruin around him. Monomon stayed in her archive, surrounded by the jellies that served her, while the teachers' quarters fell silent, and her students either died or fled. In Deepnest, Hera continued her eternal slumber in the beast's den, while the spiders wove their webs, and the terrible creatures of the deep fed on whatever wandered into their territory. The Mantis tribe faced a crisis of their own when the Mantis Lords discovered that one of their own had been seduced by the power of the infection, because the Radiance's influence offered a kind of unity, a freedom from individual thought, that some broken minds found appealing. The Traitor Lord, as this Mantis would be called, took followers and fled deeper into the kingdom, establishing their own colony in the Queen's Gardens, where they worshipped the infection as if it were a blessing rather than a curse. The Pale King's disappearance. At some point during the kingdom's decline, the Pale King simply vanished, and to this day, the exact circumstances of his disappearance remain one of Hallownest's greatest mysteries. Some believe he died of grief or shame, unable to bear the failure of his grand design, while others think he fled the kingdom seeking a solution in distant lands or in places between reality where higher beings can walk. The most haunting theory is that he hid himself and his palace in a fold of reality accessible only through the dream realm, making himself and his greatest works nearly impossible to find, as if he wanted to be forgotten. His throne room in the White Palace remained intact, frozen in time, with his corpse sitting on the throne, dressed in his royal raiment, with a massive spike driven through his head, though whether this was suicide or assassination, or something else entirely, remains unclear. The king's sole charm split into two halves, with one remaining in the White Palace and the other given to the White Lady, as if the symbol of their unity needed to be broken along with everything else they had built together. Without the pale king's presence, without his light to guide them, the insects of Hallownest, who weren't already infected, began to lose their minds in a different way, because the gift of consciousness he had given them may have been dependent on his continued existence, or at least his active power. Some insects simply forgot who they were, reverting to more primitive states, while others clung desperately to the last shreds of civilization, performing duties that no longer had any purpose in a kingdom that had essentially ceased to exist. The long sleep Hallownest entered what could be called a period of stasis, where the kingdom wasn't quite dead, but certainly wasn't alive anymore, existing in a state of suspended decay. The infection was everywhere, but contained by the fact that there were fewer and fewer uninfected minds for the Radiants to claim, while those who remained uninfected mostly hid in safe places or fled the kingdom entirely. The City of Tears continued to rain its eternal rain, washing over empty streets and silent buildings where ghosts sometimes appeared, the lingering spirits of those who had died unable to move on. In the resting grounds, the cemetery keeper, who called himself the Gravedigger, maintained his vigil, tending to graves and offering the service of dream-nail use to those few travellers who still passed through. The howling cliffs echoed with the sounds of wind and the distant screams of creatures that had never been part of Hallownest proper, existing on the kingdom's edges, where civilization had never fully taken hold. In the ancient basin where the corpse of the worm lay forgotten, and where the abyss opened into infinite darkness, nothing changed, because these places had always been separate from the kingdom proper, existing before Hallownest, and likely to exist long after. The fungal wastes adapted to the new reality, with the mushroom creatures continuing their strange life cycle, and the mantises maintaining their watch, though now they guarded borders that separated dead lands from dying lands. Deepnest remained as it had always been, a place of darkness and predation, where the strong fed on the weak, and where the infection made little difference, because the spiders and the beasts that lived there had always been hostile and territorial. Elderbug's lonely vigil. At the very edge of the kingdom, in a small settlement called Dirtmouth, an old bug who had come to be known as Elderbug maintained his lonely vigil. Dirtmouth had once been a bustling town where miners and travellers gathered before descending into Hallownest proper, but now it was almost entirely abandoned, with only Elderbug remaining, along with a few other stubborn souls. He would sit on his bench day after day, watching the well that led down into the kingdom below, occasionally greeting the rare traveller who passed through, though such visitors became increasingly uncommon as years turned into decades. Elderbug had seen Hallownest's golden age, had watched the kingdom prosper, and had witnessed the first signs of decline, though he probably didn't understand what was truly happening in the depths below. He maintained the traditions of hospitality that had once been Hallownest's pride, offering directions and advice to anyone who might need it, even though he probably suspected that anyone who went down into the kingdom might never return. Near Dirtmouth, a cartographer named Cornifer wandered the upper areas of the kingdom, mapping regions and selling his work to the rare traveller, while his wife Iselda maintained a small shop. Sly the shopkeeper had sealed himself away in a state of deep meditation, or perhaps imprisonment, having succumbed partially to infection or simple old age, leaving his shop abandoned. The stag station in Dirtmouth remained functional, with the last stag faithfully continuing his duty of transporting passengers through the network of underground stations that connected Hallownest's far-flung regions, though his passengers had dwindled to almost nothing. The ghost awakens into this dying kingdom at the moment when all hope seemed lost, when the Hollow Knight's seal was on the verge of complete failure, when the radiance was almost free to consume everything. In her burning light, a small figure emerged from the darkness beyond Hallownest's borders. This was another vessel, one of the thousands that had been born in the abyss, and left to die, one that had fallen back into the darkness, when the Hollow Knight had been chosen, and the Pale King had sealed the abyss behind him. Somehow, impossibly, this vessel had survived in the void for all the years of Hallownest's rise and fall, perhaps protected by the very emptiness that was supposed to make it a suitable container, perhaps sustained by something we don't understand about the void's nature. This vessel was smaller than the Hollow Knight, and may have been even more hollow, or perhaps it had developed differently, having spent so long in darkness, without any of the raising or training that its sibling had received. The people who would encounter this vessel would call it many things, the Knight or the Ghost or simply Little One, but it had no name for itself because it was supposedly as empty as the Hollow Knight was meant to be. When the Ghost entered Hallownest, it came without obvious purpose, climbing up from whatever distant region it had wandered through, simply moving forward, drawn by something that might have been instinct, or might have been the faintest echo of memory. It arrived in Dirtmouth, where Elderbug greeted it with surprise and cautious optimism, because visitors had become so rare. And here was this small strange creature, with a nail on its back, looking down into the well that led to Hallownest as if it intended to descend. The Ghost's descent. The Ghost dropped into the well, falling through darkness until it landed in the King's Pass, an area that had once been a main entrance to the kingdom, but which had long since been sealed off and forgotten. It fought its way through the infected creatures that infested these abandoned tunnels, learning or remembering how to wield the nail it carried, discovering that despite its small size, it was capable of significant combat prowess. When it emerged into the forgotten crossroads, the main hub area connecting many parts of Hallownest, the Ghost encountered a kingdom in its death throes, with infected creatures shambling through tunnels, and the whole area having a feeling of decay. But it also found signs that Hallownest had been something more, because the architecture remained beautiful in its ruin, because there were statues and carvings and careful stonework that spoke of a civilization that had cared about such things. The Ghost met an old wanderer named Quirrell, who was exploring the kingdom, trying to piece together memories he had lost, accompanied by a strange mask that seemed to be guiding him towards some unknown destination. It encountered Hornet, who immediately recognized what the Ghost was because she had been born from the same purpose that had created the vessels, and she challenged it to combat testing whether this ghost shell was strong enough to be worth her attention. After their first battle, Hornet warned the Ghost to turn back to leave Hallownest because she understood that any vessel that stayed in the kingdom would eventually be drawn into the same fate that had befallen the Hollow Knight. But the Ghost didn't turn back, whether because it couldn't understand the warning, or because it felt compelled to continue, or because on some level it knew what it had been created to do and was determined to fulfill that purpose. Gathering power. As the Ghost explored more of Hallownest, it grew stronger, absorbing the soul of defeated enemies, learning new abilities from the remnants of power left behind in the kingdom's depths. It found charms left by dead explorers, or hidden in secret places, items imbued with various powers that could enhance its abilities, making it faster or stronger, or granting it new ways to manipulate soul. In the City of Tears, the Ghost climbed through the blue-tinted districts, fighting infected guards and hostile spirits, discovering the majesty that Hallownest's capital had once possessed. It could look out over the city and see the full scope of what had been built here, with massive structures carved from stone channels of water flowing through carefully designed paths, and even in ruin, an undeniable beauty to the architecture. The Ghost found Lem in his small shop, a relic seeker, who was trying to preserve some knowledge of Hallownest's history, collecting the artifacts and trinkets that remained scattered throughout the kingdom. Through exploration, the ghost began to piece together the history of this place, though it left no record of its understanding, because vessels don't speak, don't write, don't express themselves in ways that others can easily comprehend. It descended into the crystal peak, where miners had once harvested the beautiful crystals that grew from the walls, finding that the laser-shooting crystal guardians still protected these places, even though there was no longer anyone to mine the resources. Deep in the heart of the peak was the crystal guardian, who challenged any who dared to intrude, rewarded those who defeated him with one of the skills needed to traverse Hallownest's more dangerous areas. In the fungal wastes, the ghost fought through the mushroom creatures and eventually faced the mantis lords in their throne room. And this battle was different because the mantis lords weren't infected, weren't mindless, but rather were testing the ghost according to their traditions. The Dreamer's Seals. When the ghost defeated the mantis lords, it earned their respect, and they bowed to it, acknowledging its strength and granting it safe passage through their village. But more importantly, through Deepnest, because the mantises controlled access to those terrible depths. The ghost learned from various sources that to reach the Hollow Night, to enter the temple of the Black Egg, where the kingdom's champion had been sealed, it would need to break the seals maintained by the three dreamers. This meant the ghost would need to find Lurien and Monomon and Hera, and somehow enter their dreams and end their eternal slumber permanently, which essentially meant killing them, because dreamers who wake from their sacred duty don't survive the experience. To enter dreams, the ghost needed the dream nail, a sacred weapon that had been kept in the resting grounds by the Moth tribe, who had once worshipped the Radiance and who maintained a small presence even in Hallownest's ruins. The ghost underwent a trial in the dream realm, facing challenges that tested its capability to navigate the space between waking and sleeping, before it was granted the dream nail by the Mothseer, who spoke cryptically about destiny and sacrifice. With the dream nail in its possession, the ghost could now perceive things that existed partially in dreams, could read the final thoughts of dead bugs, and could enter the dream realms of sleeping creatures, including the dreamers. It travelled to the City of Tears and climbed Lurien's spire, where the Watcher remained asleep, surrounded by his loyal butler and the protective magic that had kept him safe for so long. The ghost entered Lurien's dream, and there ended the Watcher's eternal vigil, breaking 1/3 of the seal that bound the Hollow Night in the Temple of the Black Egg. Into Deepnest next. The ghost descended into Deepnest, and this area represented everything that the Pale King's civilization had been trying to rise above, because here in the darkness, the laws of Hallownest had never truly taken hold. Deepnest was a maze of twisting passages and vertical shafts, where massive spider creatures waited to ambush prey, where the corpse creepers infested the remains of dead beasts, and where the darkness was so complete that even with a lantern visibility remained minimal. The ghost navigated through this nightmare terrain, fighting through stalking devouts and garpedes and those terrible spider creatures that could kill in just a few hits, discovering that Deepnest was far larger than it had appeared on maps. Deep in the heart of this region was the Beast's Den, where Hera slept surrounded by her spider subjects and protected by the creature known as the Midwife, who tended to the beast even in her endless slumber. The ghost entered Hera's dream and broke the second seal, ending the life of Hornet's mother, who had sacrificed herself so long ago to ensure the Hollow Night could be bound properly. Hornet would feel. This death would know the moment her mother's consciousness finally ended, and it would add another layer of complexity to her relationship with the ghost, because this vessel had just killed one of the few family members she had left. The archive's secrets. The final dreamer was Monomon in her archive, and reaching her required the ghost to navigate through the Fog Canyon, an area filled with jellyfish-like creatures called Umus that were mostly harmless but which could swarm in dangerous numbers. The archive itself was a structure dedicated to preserving knowledge, with Monomon having spent her life, before the sealing ritual, studying and teaching, and trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality. The teacher had surrounded herself with loyal jellies who, even now, protected her sleeping form, and she had left instructions with her most trusted assistant, Quirrell, who had been sent away from Hallownest before the kingdom's fall. Quirrell had returned without his memories, guided by Monomon's mask, to witness the kingdom's state, and ultimately to help fulfill his teacher's final request. Because Monomon, unlike the other dreamers, had understood that the seal might one day need to be broken. She had left mechanisms in place to allow access to her dreaming self, had prepared for the possibility that the Hollow Knight's prison would fail and that a new solution would be needed. When the ghost encountered Quirrell at the archive, he recognized what needed to happen, and he helped the ghost reach Monomon's chamber, acknowledging the tragedy of what they were about to do, but understanding its necessity. The ghost entered Monomon's dream and broke the final seal, ending the teacher's eternal vigil. And with all three dreamers dead, the magical barriers containing the Hollow Knight in the Temple of the Black Egg began to weaken. The temple opens. The ghost returned to the forgotten crossroads, but found that something terrible had happened in its absence, because the infection had intensified throughout the region, transforming it into what could only be called the infected crossroads. The pustules that had dotted some walls and enemies now covered everything with a thick organic material that pulsed with sickly orange light, and the air itself seemed thick with the radiance's influence. The enemies had become more aggressive, more numerous, and new infected creatures had emerged from wherever they had been hiding or gestating, including the horrible light seed creatures that floated through the air, spreading infection. This escalation had occurred because the Hollow Knight's seal was weakening, because the radiance could feel her prison crumbling and was pushing harder than ever against the barriers that contained her. The ghost made its way to the Temple of the Black Egg, where it found that the massive door had opened for the first time in ages, the seal that had kept it shut now broken with the death of the three dreamers. Inside the temple was a vast chamber with a single massive egg in the centre, and suspended within that egg, wrapped in chains, and clearly suffering, was the Hollow Knight. The Hollow Knight had been standing in that darkness for so long that its body had begun to deteriorate, with the infection leaking from cracks in its shell, and its stance showing the strain of containing something that desperately wanted to be free. When the ghost entered the chamber, Hornet appeared as well, because she had been waiting for this moment, had known it would come, and she tried one final time to warn the vessel, to make it understand what challenging the Hollow Knight would mean. But the ghost pressed forward, and Hornet threw herself between them, engaging the ghost in combat that was more desperate than their previous encounters, because she was trying to stop what she saw as a futile sacrifice. The ghost defeated Hornet without killing her, leaving her unconscious on the temple floor, and approached the Hollow Knight, who sensed its sibling's presence, and perhaps recognized in some dim way what was about to happen. The Hollow Knight's agony. The Hollow Knight raised its nail and engaged the ghost in combat, but this was not a fight between enemies. This was something far more tragic, because the Hollow Knight was not attacking out of hostility, but out of a desperate need to maintain its purpose. Every strike the Hollow Knight made was an attempt to drive the ghost away, to protect it from the fate of becoming the next vessel to be sealed to suffering the same eternal torment that the Hollow Knight had endured. The Hollow Knight's fighting style was aggressive and powerful, using techniques that clearly showed the training it had received in the White Palace, wielding its nail with a skill that far exceeded most warriors in Hallownest. But as the battle progressed, the Hollow Knight's condition became more apparent, because the infection was bursting from its body in violent eruptions, and at certain points the knight would stop fighting entirely and begin to stab itself. These moments of self-harm with a hollow knight trying to contain the radiance, trying to damage itself to prevent her from escaping, trying even at the end to fulfill the purpose it had been created for, despite the agony it was experiencing. The ghost fought on, whittling down its sibling strength, watching as the once proud knight who had been Hallownest's champion deteriorated before its eyes, becoming more desperate, more pained, more clearly a victim than a villain. When the ghost finally struck the blow that brought the hollow knight to its knees, the larger vessel collapsed forward, and for a moment there was stillness in the temple, as if the kingdom itself was holding its breath. Then Hornet stirred, regaining consciousness, and seeing what had happened, and the ghost was faced with a choice about how to proceed, because there were multiple paths forward. From this point, each with different implications for Hallownest's future. The Hollow Knight ending. In one possibility, the ghost simply takes the Hollow Knight's place, allowing itself to be sealed in the black egg, becoming the new vessel to contain the radiance. And this is perhaps the most straightforward ending, but also the most tragic. The Hornet, who has witnessed everything, understands what the ghost intends, and though she might want to stop it, she also knows that without a vessel to contain the radiance, the kingdom will be completely consumed by the infection within days or weeks. She performs the sealing ritual, binding the ghost in chains, in the same egg, where the Hollow Knight had suffered for so long, and she becomes the new dreamer, the sole seal maintaining the prison, because there are no others left who could take on this role. The temple door closes, and Hornet enters her eternal slumber, outside maintaining the barrier that keeps the radiance contained within the ghost, and Hallownest is saved for now. But this is only a temporary solution, because the ghost is no more truly hollow than the Hollow Knight was, and eventually the same cracks will form, the same consciousness will develop, and the seal will fail again. Perhaps it will take centuries, or perhaps mere decades, but the cycle will repeat, and another vessel would be needed, and there are no more vessels left in the world, except for the one now sealed away. This ending saves Hallownest in the short term, but dooms it in the long term to the same fate the kingdom was always heading toward, which is eventual consumption by the infection when the final seal inevitably fails. The dream no more ending. But there is another path, one that requires the ghost to have gathered more power, to have ventured into the deepest parts of the kingdom and discovered secrets that most of Hallownest's citizens never knew existed. If the ghost has acquired the void heart by reuniting the two halves of the king's soul and taking it into the abyss, where it transforms into something that represents mastery over the void itself, then a different option becomes available. When the Hollow Knight falls and the ghost prepares to take its place, Hornet recognizes something different about this vessel, sees that it carries the void heart, and she throws the dream nail to the ghost instead of beginning the sealing ritual. The ghost uses the dream nail on the fallen Hollow Knight and enters not just a dream, but the battlefield where the true fight has been happening all along, because inside the Hollow Knight's mind, the Radiance has been waging war against the vessel's will, trying to break free. The ghost finds itself in a dream realm where the Hollow Knight's consciousness exists as a chained and tormented shade, and at the far end of a long platform made of the Hollow Knight's own memories stands the Radiance in her full terrible glory. The Radiance is a being of pure light, with the body of a moth, but enlarged to massive proportions, radiating with such intense luminosity that she seems to burn away the darkness around her. She recognizes the ghost as another vessel, as a threat to her freedom, and she attacks with all the power of a higher being, using beams of light and summoning platforms and creating sword attacks made of pure radiance. The battle is desperate and intense, with the ghost having to dodge patterns of light that fill the entire arena, while finding brief moments to strike back at this god who has been the source of all Hallownest's suffering. When the ghost manages to damage the Radiance enough, something changes in the dream realm, because the void that makes up the ghost's essence begins to respond to the void heart's call. The darkness at the edges of the dream starts to encroach on the Radiance's light, and from the abyss far below, both physically and metaphysically, the shades of the other vessels begin to rise. These are the siblings that died in the darkness, that never had the chance to climb out or fulfill any purpose, and they have been waiting in the void for all these years, perhaps aware, on some level, perhaps not, but certainly connected to any vessel that still exists in the world. The ghost's presence, the void heart's power, and the radiance's weakened state combine to give these shades purpose for the first time in their existence, and they surge upward into the dream realm, manifesting as tendrils of living darkness. The radiance tries to fight back, burning away the void with her light, but there are too many of them, thousands of vessels worth of void, all focused on the single purpose of ending this god who has tormented the kingdom they were created to save. The tendrils wrap around the radiance, pulling her down, dragging her toward the darkness below, and she fights desperately, trying to break free, trying to burn away the shadows, but for every tendril she destroys, 10 more take its place. The ghost strikes the final blow, landing on the radiance's face with its nail, and with that strike the god's resistance finally breaks, and the void consumes her completely, dragging her consciousness down into the abyss where higher beings supposedly cannot be killed, but can perhaps be imprisoned forever in a way that no seal or vessel could ever accomplish. The radiance's end, with the radiance truly defeated, not just contained, but actually destroyed, or at least removed from existence in any meaningful way, the dream realm begins to collapse because it was being sustained by her power. The ghost falls through the dissolving dream and wakes in the real world, in the temple of the Black Egg, where the Hollow Knight has been freed from its burden, and where Hornet waits to see what will happen next. The infection throughout Hallownest begins to fade immediately, without the radiance's influence to sustain it, the orange pustules withering, and the glowing eyes of infected creatures dimming as they either die or return to some semblance of their previous selves. The kingdom has been saved, truly saved, in a way that the Pale King's seal never could have accomplished, because the source of the infection has been eliminated rather than merely contained. But this victory comes at a cost, because the ghost used the void heart to call forth the power of the abyss, and in doing so may have sacrificed its own existence as well. Some interpretations suggest the ghost is destroyed along with the radiance consumed by the same void that devoured the god, while others believe the vessel survives, but is forever changed by what it has experienced and accomplished. Hornet is left as perhaps the last heir to Hallownest's throne, as the daughter of the Pale King, and Hera, the only being in the kingdom with the power and the right to try to rebuild what has been lost, though whether she chooses to do so or whether she simply leaves to find her own path remains unclear. Godmaster and the Pantheons. But there are depths beneath depths to this story, because in the royal waterways, beneath the City of Tears, hidden behind a wall that appears solid, there is a secret chamber that leads to a place called Godhome. Godhome exists partially outside normal reality as a location created and maintained by a tribe of bugs who worship strength and combat, who have created what they call pantheons, which are essentially gauntlets of boss fights against the spirits or memories of Hallownest's greatest warriors. These bugs worship the concept of gods, and they have been watching the events of Hallownest unfold, seeing the rise and fall of the kingdom, and waiting for a being powerful enough to challenge and defeat every single warrior that Godhome contains. The ghost can discover this place, and if it proves itself strong enough, it can challenge the pantheons, ascending through increasingly difficult sequences of battles against every boss and mini-boss it has encountered throughout its journey. The first pantheon contains relatively easier challenges, while later pantheons require the ghost to defeat multiple difficult bosses in succession without healing opportunities between them, testing not just skill, but stamina and resource management. The ultimate challenge is the Pantheon of Hallownest, which contains every single boss in the game, fought one after another in a marathon battle that can take hours to complete, even for skilled players. But if the ghost manages to complete even this challenge, there is one more secret, one final boss that appears only to those who have proven themselves absolutely worthy. And this boss is called the Absolute Radiance. The Absolute Radiance is the radiance at her full power, not weakened by being contained in the hollow night, not diminished by years of imprisonment, but rather at the peak of her strength as she existed before the Pale King's plan was enacted. She is faster, more aggressive, has more attacks, and is generally considered one of the most difficult bosses in any video game ever created, requiring perfect execution and deep knowledge of all her patterns. Defeating the Absolute Radiance in Godhome doesn't change the main story, but it does represent the ghost, achieving something that even the Pale King never could, which is complete and total victory over the Radiance, not through sealing or containment, but through pure combat prowess. In the ending that follows this victory, the bugs of Godhome worship the ghost as the new god, a being that has transcended its origins as an empty vessel to become something greater. Though what exactly that means for the ghost's consciousness and identity remains ambiguous. There is also an alternative version of this ending where, if the ghost has been infected by letting the infection enter itself before entering Godhome, the Absolute Radiance's defeat results in the ghost becoming a new god of the infection, spreading the plague rather than ending it and breaking free from Godhome into the real Hallownest. This dark ending suggests that even the ghost with all its power and all its accomplishments could become corrupted, could become the very thing it was meant to destroy if it makes the wrong choices or succumbs to the Radiance's influence. The grim troop's arrival. Beyond even this, there are other stories woven into Hallownest's history, because in the Howling Cliffs there is a musician named Broom, who is part of a travelling circus known as the Grim Troop. If the ghost lights a particular torch in the cliffs, it sends a signal that summons the Grim Troop to Dirtmouth, and suddenly the abandoned town has visitors in the form of strange bugs who set up tents and perform shows and speak of their master. The master of the Grim Troop is a being called Grim, or more specifically, Nightmare King. Grim, a creature that exists in a perpetual cycle of death and rebirth, collecting the flames of dying kingdoms to sustain his existence. Grim takes an interest in the ghost, seeing in it a suitable vessel, not for containing gods, but for participating in the ritual that will allow Grim to die and be reborn through a younger version of himself, called Grimchild. The ghost is tasked with collecting flames from various locations throughout Hallownest, flames that represent the dying embers of the kingdom's former glory, and each flame makes the Grimchild stronger, helping it mature. When enough flames have been collected, Grim reveals his true nature and challenges the ghost to combat not as an enemy, but as part of the ritual, because Grim needs to be defeated to complete his transformation. The battle against Grim is elegant and theatrical, with the Nightmare King bowing before and after attacks, teleporting around the arena, and using flame-based abilities that create beautiful patterns even as they threaten to incinerate the ghost. Defeating Grim allows the ritual to proceed, but there is an alternative where the ghost can choose to banish the Grim Troop, instead working with Broom, who has grown tired of the endless cycle and wants to break free from Grim's influence. This choice fundamentally alters the outcome, with the troop being driven away, and Broom finding peace but also denying Grim his rebirth, and potentially angering forces that transcend Hallownest itself. The Hive and its kingdom. In the far reaches of the kingdom beyond the Fog Canyon, and hidden behind breakable walls, there is a place called the Hive, where a completely separate insect society exists within Hallownest's borders, but largely independent of the Pale King's rule. The Hive is home to bees who have organised themselves around their queen, and who produce honey that has various magical properties that other bugs find valuable. The bees are hostile to intruders and will attack the ghost on sight, defending their territory with coordinated swarm tactics and powerful individual fighters called Hive Knights. At the heart of the Hive is Hive Knight himself, a champion who guards the approaches to the queen and who wields a massive nail-like weapon with devastating effect. The hive represents an interesting counterpoint to Hallownest proper, because these bees don't seem to have been directly granted consciousness by the Pale King, yet they clearly have organisation and purpose, suggesting that there were other paths to civilization beyond the worm's gift. The honey they produce can heal wounds or provide energy, and the ghost can collect masks and other items from the hive if it proves strong enough to fight through the defenders. The queen herself is never seen, but her presence is felt throughout the hive, in the devotion of her subjects, and in the way the entire society is organised around serving and protecting her. This storyline doesn't directly connect to the main plot about the radiance and the infection, but it adds depth to Hallownest by showing that the Pale King's kingdom was never as unified or comprehensive as he might have believed, that there were always pockets of independence and alternative social structures. The White Lady's grief. In the Queen's gardens, hidden behind thorny vines that only open when certain conditions are met, the White Lady remains bound by roots of her own, making having retreated here when Hallownest began to fall. The ghost can find her and speak with her through dialogue options, and she reveals information about the vessels, about the plan to seal the radiance, and about her own guilt over what was done. The White Lady expresses something like maternal grief for the thousands of vessels that were born and abandoned in the abyss, acknowledging that they were her children, even if they were never meant to be treated as such. She bound herself in the gardens, partially as penance, partially to contain her own power, because she feared that in the kingdom's chaos she might do more harm than good. The White Lady recognises the ghost for what it is, and she offers guidance, and one half of the King's soul charm if the ghost can navigate through her gardens and prove itself worthy. The gardens themselves are beautiful, but deadly, with the traitor lord's followers having established themselves among the flowers, and with the mantises who abandoned their tribe's honour, attacking anything that moves. Fighting through to reach the White Lady requires skill and determination, but the rewards are significant both in terms of items and in terms of understanding the full tragedy of what the Pale King and White Lady created. The White Lady speaks of her former husband with a mixture of love and disappointment, acknowledging his brilliance but also his fundamental flaw, which was his inability to accept imperfection in his plans, leading him to forge ahead with a solution he should have known couldn't work forever. The abyss's depths. When the ghost finally descends into the abyss, having gathered the two halves of the King's soul, it enters a darkness so complete that even the Lumafly lantern provides only minimal illumination. The abyss is where the ghost was born, where thousands of its siblings fell and died, where the void exists in its purest form as a lake of living darkness that predates all of Hallownest. At the very bottom of the abyss, past platforming challenges that require precise jumping and careful navigation, there is a structure that looks almost like a shrine, and when the ghost places the King's soul, there the charm transforms. The King's soul, which represented the unity of the Pale King and White Lady, which symbolised their combined power, and their partnership breaks apart and reforms as the Void Heart. The Void Heart is described in its charm notification as something that unifies the void under the bearer's will, suggesting that the ghost has achieved what might be called kingship over the void itself, becoming not just a vessel, but something that can command and direct the primordial darkness. With the Void Heart in its possession, the ghost gains the ability to access areas it couldn't before, and more importantly, it changes how the void responds to the ghost's presence. When the ghost returns to various locations throughout Hallownest, with the Void Heart creatures made of void no longer attack it, and in the abyss itself, something remarkable happens. The shades of all the other vessels, all the siblings that died, begin to manifest not as hostile creatures but as a kind of honour guard, acknowledging the ghost as their representative, as the one who succeeded where they all failed. This moment is both triumphant and deeply sad because it emphasises just how many vessels were created and discarded, how many potential lives were ended before they really began, all in service of a plan that was fundamentally flawed from the start. The ghost can sit on a throne in the abyss, a mockery, or perhaps an echo of the Pale King's throne, and when it does, the shades gather around it in what might be reverence, or might simply be recognition of kinship. Quirrell's fate. Throughout the ghost's journey, one of the most consistently helpful and tragic characters is Quirrell the Wanderer, who appears in various locations offering commentary and occasionally assistance. Quirrell is searching for something he's forgotten, having been sent away from Hallownest by Monomon before the kingdom's fall, with his memories sealed by the mask he wears. As the ghost progresses and eventually breaks Monomon's seal, Quirrell's purpose is fulfilled and his memories begin to return, which brings him both understanding and profound sadness. The ghost encounters Quirrell one final time at the Blue Lake, a peaceful area above the City of Tears, where water pools in a serene cavern far from the infection and chaos of the kingdom below. Quirrell sits by the lake, having removed his mask and finally remembering everything about who he was and what Hallownest meant to him, and he speaks with the ghost about the kingdom's beauty and tragedy. He talks about how, even in ruin, there's something worth remembering about Hallownest, how the kingdom achieved something remarkable, even if it ultimately failed, and he seems to be at peace with the role he played in its story. When the ghost leaves and returns to the Blue Lake later, Quirrell is gone, with only his nail left behind, stuck in the ground, beside the water, suggesting that he walked into the lake and didn't come back. Whether this represents suicide, or some form of transcendence, or simply moving on to whatever comes after death for the bugs of Hallownest remains ambiguous, but it's presented as a gentle ending for a character who'd been searching for meaning. Quirrell's story represents the tragedy of Hallownest in microcosm, because he was someone who loved the kingdom, who served it faithfully, who was sent away for his own protection, only to return and find everything he cared about in ruins, and his purpose fulfilled through an act that contributed to the kingdom's end. The Soul Sanctum's horror. The Soul Sanctum in the City of Tears stands as a monument to how desperation can corrupt even scholarly pursuits, because what began as legitimate research into the nature of soul devolved into a nightmare of experimentation and torture. The Soul Master who led the Sanctum became obsessed with immortality, believing that by accumulating enough soul, he could transcend death and perhaps find a way to survive the infection. His researchers followed him down this dark path either out of loyalty or their own fear of death, and together they turned the Sanctum into a factory of suffering. Living bugs were captured and brought to the Sanctum, where their soul was forcibly extracted through processes that left them as empty husks called mistakes creatures that barely retained any awareness but continued to move, animated by some residual spark. The Soul Master himself transformed through his experiments, becoming bloated and monstrous, able to teleport and hurl soul-based attacks, but clearly insane, his mind as corrupted as his body. When the ghost challenges the Soul Master in his laboratory, the battle reveals just how powerful and how pathetic he has become, because he fights desperately, using every trick and technique he has developed, but ultimately he's just a broken bug clinging to existence. Defeating the Soul Master doesn't restore the Sanctum or bring back any of his victims, but it does end the horror that was being perpetuated there, and it provides access to powerful spells that the ghost can use, including Desolate Dive, which allows for devastating downward attacks. The Sanctum also contains shades, the spirits of bugs who died there, and their presence throughout the building serves as a constant reminder of the price that was paid for the Soul Master's obsessive quest for immortality. Some of these shades can be fought and defeated, releasing their spirits to whatever rest exists for the dead in Hallownest, while others simply observe, unable to move on, but also unable to do anything except exist in their tormented state. The Soul Sanctum represents what happens when fear of death combines with the power to act on that fear, without ethical constraints, showing that the infection wasn't the only thing that could corrupt the bugs of Hallownest. Cloth's sacrifice. In the ancient basin and later in Deepnest, the ghost can encounter a warrior named Cloth who has come to Hallownest seeking glory and worthy challenges to test herself against. Cloth is friendly and enthusiastic about treating combat as an adventure rather than a tragedy, and she respects the ghost as a fellow warrior when she sees its capabilities. She speaks of her desire to find a battle worthy of her skills, to die in combat against a truly formidable foe, because in her culture there is honour in such a death. The ghost can encounter Cloth multiple times, and eventually she will appear during the fight against the traitor lord in the Queen's Gardens, rushing in to help battle this powerful enemy. If the ghost has met Cloth enough times and triggered her appearance in this fight, she will fight alongside the ghost, making the battle somewhat easier, but also putting herself at risk. When the traitor lord falls, Cloth is badly wounded, and she realises that this is the glorious end she'd been seeking, dying in battle against a powerful foe while fighting alongside someone she respects. She thanks the ghost, expresses satisfaction that she found what she was looking for, and then dies there in the Queen's Gardens, having achieved her goal. This storyline is interesting because Cloth is one of the few characters in Hollow Knight who gets what could be called a happy ending, even though it involves her death, because she dies satisfied, having lived according to her values and achieved what she set out to do. It's a stark contrast to so many other characters who die in despair or confusion or without ever accomplishing their goals, and it shows that in Hallownest's ruins there are still opportunities for meaning and purpose, even if they lead to death. If the ghost doesn't trigger Cloth's appearance in the Traitor Lord fight, she will instead appear in Dirtmouth later, having left Hallownest alive, but dissatisfied, feeling like she didn't find what she was looking for during her time in the kingdom. Myla's tragedy. In the Crystal Peak, a cheerful bug named Myla can be found mining the crystal walls and singing a little song about her work, finding treasures in the beautiful crystal formations that grow throughout this area. When the ghost first encounters Myla, she is uninfected and friendly, acknowledging the ghost's presence and continuing her work with obvious enjoyment of the simple act of mining. Myla's song is one of the few moments of genuine happiness in Hallownest, a reminder that even in a dying kingdom, some bugs were still living their lives and finding joy in simple things. But as the game progresses, as the infection spreads more intensely throughout the Forgotten Crossroads, and as the Radiance's influence grows stronger, Myla begins to change. If the ghost returns to Crystal Peak later, Myla will show signs of infection, with orange pustules appearing on her body, and her song becoming more halting, more confused. Eventually, Myla becomes fully infected, losing all awareness, standing in place or wandering aimlessly, no longer mining, no longer singing, just another victim of the Radiance's influence. The game never requires the ghost to kill Myla. She can be left alone, even when fully infected, but some players choose to end her suffering, striking her down rather than leaving her in that state. Myla's story is particularly tragic because she represents the ordinary citizens of Hallownest, the bugs who weren't warriors or scholars or involved in any of the grand plans, who were just living their lives when everything fell apart. She had no way to protect herself, no special powers or abilities, just a simple joy in her work that was taken from her by forces completely beyond her control or understanding, and her fate reminds players that the infection wasn't just a threat to Hallownest as a kingdom, but to every individual life within it. Zote's failure. Throughout Hallownest, the ghost can encounter a bug named Zote, who claims to be a great knight and warrior, but who is demonstrably incompetent and cowardly in actual combat situations. Zote carries a nail made of shellwood called Life Ender, though the nail is so brittle and poorly made that it cannot actually damage enemies, making Zote essentially helpless in any real fight. The ghost first encounters Zote in the Green Path, being attacked by a Vengefly King, and players have the choice to save Zote or leave him to die. If saved, Zote will appear in various locations throughout the game, always boasting about his achievements and reciting his 57 precepts, which are rules he claims to live by, though many of them are contradictory or absurd. Zote represents a particular kind of character that exists in many stories. The person who has built their entire identity around being something they're not, who cannot accept their own limitations or failures. He genuinely seems to believe he is a great warrior, despite all evidence to the contrary, and he treats the ghost with a mixture of dismissiveness and jealousy, unable to accept that this silent vessel is far more capable than he is. If Zote is saved multiple times, he eventually makes his way to Dartmouth, where he tells absurd stories about his adventures, and if the ghost has also rescued Bretta, a timid bug, from fungal wastes, she becomes infatuated with Zote based on his stories. Bretta begins to dream of Zote as a great hero, and through the dream nail, the ghost can enter her dreams and fight Grey Prince Zote, a version of Zote that exists only in Bretta's imagination, who actually is powerful and dangerous. This dream version of Zote can be fought multiple times, with the difficulty increasing each time, and defeating him eventually causes Bretta to become disillusioned with Zote seeing through his lies, and either leaving Dartmouth or transferring her affections to the ghost instead. Zote's storyline is darkly comic, providing moments of levity in an otherwise tragic story, but it also serves to highlight how self-delusion can be both a shield against harsh reality and a trap that prevents growth or genuine connection with others. Elderbug's persistence. Throughout everything that happens in Hallownest, as the ghost defeats bosses and breaks seals and battles gods, Elderbug remains on his bench in Dartmouth, serving as a constant presence and a reminder of ordinary life. He greets the ghost each time it returns to the surface, offering simple observations about Dartmouth and the few other bugs who pass through, and expressing his hope that the ghost is staying safe. Elderbug doesn't know what the ghost is doing in the depths below, doesn't understand the true nature of the threat facing Hallownest, but he worries about this small warrior who keeps descending into danger. As the game progresses, Elderbug's dialogue changes slightly, reflecting events happening around him, like the arrival of the Grim Troop, or the return of other NPCs to Dartmouth, and he seems pleased that the town is becoming less lonely. There's something deeply poignant about Elderbug's character, because he represents the absolute end of Hallownest's reach, the final point where the kingdom's influence extends into the world above, and yet he remains committed to his role as greeter and guardian of this abandoned town. He has no great destiny, no heroic purpose. He's just an old bug who maintains the traditions of hospitality even when there are almost no travellers left to be hospitable to. The ghost can give Elderbug a delicate flower, one of the rarest and most fragile items in the game, which requires carrying it from the Queen's Gardens all the way to Dartmouth without taking any damage, and if the ghost manages this, Elderbug is overjoyed and grateful, placing the flower in his home, and expressing genuine happiness at this small kindness. This interaction is optional and provides no mechanical benefit, but it's one of the few purely kind actions the ghost can take that isn't connected to combat or quest completion, just making someone happy for its own sake. Elderbug's presence and his simple kindness serve as an anchor point, reminding players that beneath all the cosmic horror and grand tragedy, there are still individual lives and small moments of connection that matter. The Mantis Lord's Honour. The Mantis Lords in their throne room at the base of the Mantis village represent a code of honour and martial tradition that stands in stark contrast to the chaos of the infection. When the ghost enters their domain after fighting through the Mantis village, the three lords sit on their thrones, observing this intruder, and one of them descends to challenge the ghost in combat. The battle against the Mantis Lords is structured like a formal duel, with clear attack patterns that test the ghost's reflexes and combat skill, but which also feel fair and honourable rather than cheap or overwhelming. When the ghost defeats the First Lord, the other two descend together, and the battle becomes more intense, but maintains that same sense of being a test rather than an execution. If the ghost defeats all three Mantis Lords, they bow in respect, acknowledging that this small vessel has proven itself worthy according to their standards, and granting it safe passage through their village. The mantises after this will no longer attack the ghost, and the way to Deep Nest, through their territory, becomes open, because the lords have declared that the ghost has earned the right to pass. This sequence is significant because it shows that not everything in Hallownest was corrupt or broken, that some traditions and values survived, even as the kingdom crumbled around them. The Mantis Lords didn't serve the Pale King. Not really, they maintained their own society and their own code, and when they made agreements, it was as equals, or near equals, not as subjects. Their willingness to honour the ghost's strength regardless of what the ghost is or where it came from demonstrates a kind of integrity that is rare in the game's world. The Mantis village also serves as a reminder that Hallownest was always more diverse than the Pale King's vision might have suggested, that there were multiple ways of organising society and multiple codes of conduct existing side by side rather than one unified culture. Bretta's dreams. Bretta is a small bug that the ghost can rescue from fungal wastes where she has been trapped by fungi and is near death from hunger or despair. Once saved, she returns to Dirtmouth, where she lives in a house, and begins to write stories and create art inspired by her rescue and by the ghost itself. Through Dreamnail dialogue, it becomes clear that Bretta has romanticised her rescue, imagining the ghost as a brave knight who came specifically to save her, rather than a vessel wandering through Hallownest on its own quest. She begins to create elaborate fantasies about the ghost, and if Zote has also been rescued, her attention shifts to him based on his boastful stories, despite the fact that everything he says is obviously false. Bretta's dreams, which the ghost can enter using the dream nail, show her idealized versions of these warriors fighting impossible battles and performing heroic deeds that never actually happened. When the ghost defeats Grey Prince Zote enough times, Bretta becomes disillusioned, and her dream changes, showing her recognition that Zote is not the hero she imagined, and either transferring her affections back to the ghost or potentially to another warrior she imagines. Eventually, if certain conditions are met, Bretta will leave Dirtmouth entirely, having apparently decided to seek adventure on her own, rather than waiting for someone else to give her life meaning. She leaves behind a journal that suggests she's grown beyond her need for heroes, to worship that she wants to become someone worthy of stories herself rather than just dreaming about others. Bretta's character arc is subtle and easy to miss, but it represents a journey from helplessness to agency, from dreaming about heroes to deciding to be one herself. And it shows that even in Hallownest's ruins, there is potential for growth and change. The Pale Ore's significance. Throughout Hallownest, there are deposits of a substance called Pale Ore, which seems to be connected to the Pale King himself, either created by his presence or attracted to his power. Pale Ore is incredibly valuable and rare, used to upgrade the ghost's nail at the nailsmith's shop in the City of Tears, making the weapon more powerful with each upgrade. The nailsmith is a craftsman who has dedicated his entire life to perfecting his art, taking pride in his ability to work with materials and create weapons of exceptional quality. When the ghost brings him Pale Ore, he uses it to upgrade the nail, and with each upgrade he becomes more excited about the project, more invested in creating what he sees as his masterpiece. After the final upgrade, when the ghost nail has been enhanced to its maximum potential, the nailsmith asks the ghost to kill him because he believes he has achieved perfection in his craft and that nothing he creates afterward could match what he has just made. Players can choose to grant his request, striking him down, or they can refuse and walk away, leaving him alive to contemplate what comes after achieving one's ultimate goal. If the ghost refuses to kill the nailsmith, he will eventually appear in Dartmouth, having found a new purpose in simply appreciating beauty and art, rather than creating it, sitting with the painter Shio and finding contentment in this companionship. The pale ore itself seems to hold properties beyond mere physical strength, as if it contains some essence of the Pale King's power or will, and using it to upgrade the nail might represent the ghost taking on aspects of the king's strength, or perhaps symbolically opposing him by using his own power against the kingdom's problems. The locations where pale ore can be found are often significant places connected to the kingdom's history or to particularly dangerous challenges, suggesting that this substance is inherently linked to Hallownest's greatest achievements and deepest tragedies. Lem's preservation. In the City of Tears, a bug named Lem runs a small shop where he buys relics and artifacts that the ghost finds throughout Hallownest, paying generous amounts of geo for items that most others would consider worthless junk. Lem is a relic seeker, someone who is trying to preserve knowledge of Hallownest's history even as the kingdom crumbles around him, collecting physical evidence of what the civilization achieved and what it valued. He provides descriptions of the items the ghost sells to him, explaining their potential purposes or historical significance, and through these descriptions, players can learn more about daily life in Hallownest before the fall. Lem is frustrated by how much has been lost, by how few bugs seem to care about preserving history or understanding where they came from, and he sees himself as fighting a losing battle against entropy and forgetting. His shop is filled with the artifacts he has collected, each one representing some aspect of Hallownest's culture, whether it's a piece of armor, a tool, a decorative object, or something whose purpose has been completely forgotten. Lem's character represents the importance of memory and history, the idea that civilizations are not just their grand achievements, but also the small details of how people lived, what they valued, what they created for practical or aesthetic purposes. Without people like Lem, without someone to collect and preserve and explain these objects, Hallownest would be forgotten entirely, leaving no trace that it ever existed beyond empty stone structures. The ghost's interaction with Lem is purely transactional, selling items for currency, but there's something poignant about this small vessel bringing fragments of the kingdom's past to someone who actually cares about them, who sees value beyond their monetary worth. Lem never learns the ghost's true nature, or purpose, never understands that this small creature is one of the keys to Hallownest's salvation or destruction, but he appreciates its contribution to his work, and that appreciation matters in its own way. The Stag Stations Network. Throughout Hallownest, there is a network of stag stations, connected by tunnels through which a creature, called the Last Stag, can travel, providing fast transportation for those who know how to call him. The stag is an ancient being, possibly as old as Hallownest itself, and he remembers when the stations were full of passengers, when his kind numbered more than just himself, when the kingdom was alive and bustling with activity. Each station the ghost opens makes the stag a little happier, restoring his sense of purpose because, for so long, he has been travelling these routes alone, with no one to carry, no reason to continue, except habit and duty. The stag speaks with melancholy about the kingdom's fall, about the passengers he used to know who are now gone or infected or dead, and about his fellow stags who disappeared, one by one, until he was the only one left. His dialogue suggests that stags are not ordinary animals, but rather beings with significant intelligence and possibly supernatural qualities, able to navigate Hallownest's confusing geography with perfect accuracy and to run for extended periods without tiring. The stations themselves are architectural marvels, carved stone platforms with benches and bells and careful attention to aesthetics, showing that Hallownest valued not just functionality, but beauty even in utilitarian spaces. Some stations are in remarkably good condition, while others have fallen into disrepair or been overtaken by enemies. But the network as a whole remains functional, a testament to the quality of construction and the stag's dedication to maintaining his roots. When the ghost discovers the hidden stag nest where the stag and his kind presumably lived before the kingdom's fall, the stag is overcome with emotion at seeing his home again, at being reminded of what he lost, and he thanks the ghost for this unexpected gift. The stag's storyline is one of perseverance and loneliness, about continuing to fulfill your purpose, even when it seems meaningless, about maintaining hope that someday passengers will return and the stations will be full again. By the end of the game, if the ghost has found all the stations, the stag expresses something like contentment, having at least one passenger to carry, having a reason to run his routes beyond simple habit. And the implication is that as long as he continues, the memory of Hallownest's better days is preserved. Salubra's blessing. In the forgotten crossroads, there is a shop run by a bug named Salubra, who sells charms and who has been waiting for customers for so long that she has almost given up hope that anyone will come. When the ghost enters her shop, Salubra is overjoyed to finally have a customer, and she offers her wares along with charm notches that increase how many charms the ghost can equip simultaneously. Salubra's enthusiasm and kindness stand out in Hallownest's dark atmosphere because she treats the ghost with genuine warmth, asking about its adventures and expressing pride in its accomplishments as if it were a friend other than just a customer. When the ghost purchases enough items from her, Salubra gives it a blessing that periodically generates soul when the ghost is sitting on benches, providing a practical benefit, but more importantly, representing her gratitude and affection. Salubra speaks about her own past, about travelling and meeting other bugs and eventually settling in this spot to open her shop, and her dialogue suggests that she has been waiting for a very long time, maintaining her business, even as Hallownest emptied around her. She never questions why the ghost is wandering through a dying kingdom, never demands explanations, just provides her services, and her kindness asking for nothing more than the opportunity to help someone on their journey. Salubra's character is a reminder that commerce and trade are not just economic activities, but also social ones, that shops and merchants serve as gathering points, and that the relationships between seller and customer can be meaningful beyond simple transactions. Her blessing is described in terms that suggest it is literally a blessing, not just a charm effect, but a piece of her goodwill and positive energy given to someone she's come to care about, and that gift persists throughout the ghost's journey, helping it in small ways during moments of rest. The failed tramway. In the deepest parts of Hallownest, accessible through various routes, there are the remains of a tramway system that was supposed to connect distant parts of the kingdom, allowing for faster travel between regions. The tramway represents an ambitious infrastructure project that was never completed or that fell into disrepair during the kingdom's decline, leaving only fragments and broken tramcars scattered through tunnels. The failed tramway is a location name that appears on maps, and it is both a geographic description and a metaphor for Hallownest's unfulfilled ambitions, for the projects that were started but never finished, because the kingdom fell before they could be completed. Walking through the tramway areas, the ghost encounters obstacles and enemies, and can see where the tracks were laid, where stations were planned or partially built, where the vision of what this system could have been is still evident despite its current state. The existence of the tramway shows that Hallownest was not static, that the Pale King and his subjects were constantly working to improve and expand the kingdom, to connect its disparate parts more efficiently, and to push the boundaries of what was architecturally possible. But it also shows the futility of such ambitions in the face of existential threats, because no matter how grand your infrastructure plans are, they mean nothing if your civilization is being destroyed from within by infection and madness. The failed tramway is a small detail in the larger story, but it adds depth to the world, showing that Hallownest had mundane concerns and practical problems alongside its cosmic struggles, that there were engineers and workers thinking about transportation logistics even as the kingdom's foundations were crumbling. Midwife's watch in Hallownest, near where Hera sleeps, there is a bug called the midwife, who tends to the beast even in her eternal slumber, and who speaks to the ghost when it arrives to break Hera's seal. The midwife is one of the few NPCs in Hallownest who is not immediately hostile, and her dialogue suggests a deep loyalty to Hera and a sadness about what the beast's sacrifice has meant for the spiders and for the region. She does not try to stop the ghost from entering Hera's dream, because she understands that the seal must be broken, that Hera's purpose is ending, and that clinging to the past will not save anyone. The midwife speaks in a way that suggests she has been caring for Hera for a very long time, that this vigil has defined her existence, and that when the ghost breaks the seal and Hera dies, the midwife will be left without purpose. Yet she accepts this with a kind of grace, acknowledging that all things end, and that Hera's death will at least serve the purpose she intended when she agreed to become a dreamer. The midwife's character adds emotional weight to the decision to break Hera's seal, because it shows that this action has consequences beyond just removing a magical barrier, that there are individuals whose lives are built around maintaining these seals who will be affected by their breaking. After Hera's death, the midwife can still be found in the beast's den, mourning her charge and contemplating what comes next for her and for the spiders of Hallownest who have lost their queen. Her presence serves as a reminder that the grand plans of higher beings and the cosmic struggles between gods have ripple effects that touch the lives of ordinary bugs who never ask to be part of these stories, but who are affected nonetheless. Mask Maker's philosophy. Hidden in the depths of Hallownest, there is a workshop where a bug called Mask Maker creates masks and speaks in strange cryptic ways about identity and appearance, and the relationship between what we show the world and what we truly are. Mask Maker sees the ghost's void-filled face and recognizes it as a kind of ultimate mask, because the ghost's lack of features means it can be anything or nothing, depending on who is looking. Mask Maker's philosophy seems to be that everyone wears masks, whether literal or figurative, and that these masks are not deceptions, but rather essential parts of how we navigate the world and relate to others. The masks that bugs wear in Hallownest are not removable for most species, because their faces are their masks. Their external appearances are fixed in ways that define how others perceive them. But Mask Maker suggests that beneath every mask there is something else, some true self that may or may not align with the face shown to the world, and that the ghost, with its empty, featureless face, represents a truth that others hide, which is that identity itself might be constructed rather than inherent. Mask Maker offers to make a mask for the ghost, though what this would accomplish or represent is left ambiguous, because how do you make a mask for something that is already all mask with nothing beneath but void? The workshop is filled with masks of various designs, showing that Mask Maker has been practicing this craft for a long time, creating faces for bugs who want to change how they appear or who need to hide what they truly are. This character adds a philosophical dimension to Hollow Knight, asking players to think about questions of identity and authenticity in a world where everyone is struggling to survive, and where showing your true self might be dangerous or meaningless. Lifeblood creatures. Throughout Hallownest, in hidden corners and secret rooms, there are strange cocoon-like creatures that emit a blue substance called lifeblood, which can provide the ghost with temporary extra masks that function like additional health. Lifeblood is described as an ancient substance, possibly predating Hallownest, and possibly connected to a different kind of higher being than either the Pale King or the Radiance. There are entire areas dedicated to lifeblood, including a hidden room accessed through a specific charm combination, where the ghost can encounter a large lifeblood creature and receive significant amounts of this blue essence. The game never fully explains what lifeblood is or where it comes from, leaving it as one of Hallownest's many mysteries, but its existence suggests that there are more forces at work in this world than just the ones directly involved in the main story. Some theories suggest that lifeblood represents a kind of life force separate from soul that it might be connected to the very fabric of the world itself, or to ancient beings that existed before any of the current factions. The Lifeblood core area, which is hidden behind breakable walls and requires specific knowledge to access, is eerily peaceful compared to most of Hallownest, with no enemies and a sense of sanctuary about it, as if this is a place untouched by the kingdom's struggles. When the ghost sits near the Lifeblood creature in this core area, it receives a blessing that persists and provides significant benefits, showing that these creatures are not hostile, but rather generous, offering their essence to anyone who finds them. The existence of Lifeblood adds another layer to Hallownest's cosmology, suggesting that the conflict between light and void, between Radiance and Pale King, is not the only spiritual or magical force in this world, that there are older, deeper wells of power that remain largely uninvolved in the affairs of insects and gods. Leg-Eater and Divine. In the fungal wastes there is a merchant named Leg-Eater who sells charms and who speaks in a distinctive manner, referring to himself in third person and obsessing over a bug named Divine. Leg-Eater claims to have found powerful charms that he offers to the ghost, though the charms are actually fragile versions that will break if the ghost takes damage while wearing them. Despite this apparent scam, Leg-Eater's prices are reasonable, and his charms can be useful if handled carefully, and more importantly, his character is connected to the Grim Troop storyline. Divine is a bug with the Grim Troop who can consume the fragile charms and transform them into unbreakable versions, making them far more valuable, but requiring the ghost to pay Divine large amounts of geo for this service. The relationship between Leg-Eater and Divine is strange and complex, with Leg-Eater being clearly infatuated with Divine, who treats him with casual cruelty, enjoying his devotion, but also taking advantage of him. If the ghost completes the process of upgrading charms through Divine and meets certain conditions, the two bugs will end up together in Dirtmouth after the Grim Troop leaves, with Leg-Eater seeming happy despite Divine's continued rough treatment of him. This storyline is one of the stranger and more darkly comic ones in Hollow Knight, showing a dysfunctional relationship that somehow works for both parties involved, even if it looks unhealthy from the outside. Leg-Eater's character also serves a practical purpose in the game's economy, allowing players to access powerful charms earlier than they might otherwise be able to if they are willing to deal with the fragility, and later providing a path to making those charms permanently useful. The way these characters intersect with the larger narrative shows how Hollow Knight weaves together its main plot about gods and vessels with smaller personal stories about individual bugs pursuing their own goals and relationships. The Colosseum of Fools. In the Kingdom's Edge, past dangerous enemies and difficult platforming, there is a massive arena called the Colosseum of Fools, where bugs fight in gladiatorial combat for the entertainment of spectators and for their own glory. The Colosseum is run by a bug named Little Fool, who manages the trials and collects entry fees from warriors who wish to test themselves in the arena. The trials themselves are brutal sequences of enemy waves that get progressively harder, with the final trial being one of the most difficult challenges in the game, requiring mastery of combat and careful resource management. Warriors who enter the Colosseum do so for various reasons, some seeking glory, some seeking death, some simply wanting to test their skills against the strongest opponents available, and the spectators who watch from above, cheer or jeer depending on the fighter's performance. The existence of the Colosseum shows that, even in Hallownest's dying days, there are still bugs who value martial prowess, who want to watch combat, and who are willing to risk their lives for entertainment or achievement. The arena is filled with spikes and hazards, and the enemies that appear include some of the toughest variants found anywhere in the kingdom, making each trial a legitimate test of the ghost's abilities. Completing all 3 trials grants the ghost access to powerful rewards and the respect of Little Fool, who acknowledges that this small vessel is one of the greatest warriors to have fought in the arena. The Colosseum represents a kind of meritocracy, where strength is the only thing that matters, where social status and history are irrelevant, and where anyone who can survive the trials is worthy of recognition. This stands in contrast to much of Hallownest, where power and position were often inherited or granted by the Pale King rather than earned through combat, and it shows that there were alternative value systems operating within the kingdom's borders. Eternal Emilitia. In the City of Tears, there is an NPC who appears as a blue spectral form, sitting in various locations, and who the ghost can interact with using the dream nail. This bug speaks about waiting for someone who has not returned, about maintaining a vigil across time, and about the nature of memory and loss. The character seems to exist between life and death, not quite a ghost, but not quite alive either, and their dialogue is poetic and melancholic, reflecting on what it means to wait for something that may never come. This NPC represents the many bugs of Hallownest who lost loved ones during the kingdom's fall, who are still waiting for returns that will never happen, still holding on to hope, even when reason suggests that hope is futile. The blue coloration and spectral nature suggest a connection to soul or to some other form of post-death existence, and the fact that the ghost can only fully interact with this character through the dream now implies that they exist partially in the dream realm. The specific location where this character appears changes, and their dialogue is always brief but impactful, providing moments of reflection and sadness that contrast with the action-focused gameplay. Characters like this throughout Hollow Knight serve to remind players that the kingdom was full of individual stories of personal tragedies that may seem small compared to the grand narrative about gods and vessels, but which are no less real to those experiencing them. The ghost cannot help this character, cannot bring back whoever they are waiting for, cannot offer any comfort beyond brief acknowledgement, but sometimes witnessing suffering and acknowledging loss is all that can be done. Void tendrils and siblings. Throughout the journey, especially in the abyss, the ghost encounters void tendrils and void creatures that represent its siblings, or at least the remnants of the thousands of vessels that died before achieving consciousness. These tendrils reach out from darkness, attempting to grab the ghost and pull it down, and whether they are hostile or simply trying to connect with the one vessel that succeeded remains ambiguous. In the abyss proper, before obtaining the void heart, these void creatures and siblings will attack the ghost, possibly out of aggression, possibly out of jealousy, possibly simply because that is their nature, as creatures of pure void without direction or purpose. But after the ghost obtains the void heart and achieves some form of mastery over the void, these same creatures become docile, no longer attacking, but instead gathering around the ghost, as if recognizing it as their representative or leader. This transformation shows that the ghost's relationship with the void and with its siblings is complex, that it is both separate from them as an individual and connected to them as part of a collective. The shades that eventually rise to help defeat the radiance in the dream. No more ending are these same siblings given purpose for the first time in their existence, unified by the ghost's will and the void heart's power to accomplish something meaningful. This suggests that the vessels were never truly empty, that even in death their void forms retained some capacity for action, and that all they needed was direction, a purpose to channel their existence toward. The tragedy is that this purpose comes too late for them to experience it as individuals, that they exist only as tools in the ghost battle, rather than as beings with their own agency. But perhaps for creatures born to be empty vessels, this is the closest thing to meaning they could ever achieve. The path of pain hidden within the White Palace, accessible only through specific movement techniques and requiring incredible platforming skill, there is a secret area called the Path of Pain. This area is filled with some of the most difficult platforming challenges in any video game, with precise timing required to navigate through saw blades and spikes and thorns in sequences that can take hours to complete, even for experienced players. The Path of Pain represents either the Pale King's trial for those who would seek to truly understand his realm, or perhaps it represents his own internal torment, the pain of knowing his plan was flawed and being unable to fix it. At the end of the Path of Pain, there is a small room where the ghost can witness a memory or vision of the Pale King and the Hollow Knight in what appears to be a moment of connection between creator and creation. In this memory, the Pale King places his hand on the Hollow Knight's shoulder in what might be a gesture of affection or pride, and the Hollow Knight's head turns slightly toward the king as if responding to this touch. This moment is significant because it shows that the Hollow Knight was not perfectly empty, that it had developed feelings, or at least responses to stimulus that should have disqualified it from serving as the Radiance's prison. The memory suggests that the Pale King either knew about this flaw and proceeded anyway, or that he blinded himself to it because he desperately wanted to believe his plan would work. The Path of Pain is optional content that most players will never see, but for those who do complete it, this memory adds crucial context to the story, confirming that the Hollow Knight's failure was inevitable from the start because it was never truly hollow. The difficulty of reaching this area makes the revelation feel earned, like a reward for dedication and skill, and it adds weight to the knowledge because players have had to suffer through their own pain to reach the truth about the Hollow Knight's suffering. The Weathered Mask. In Deepness, there is a mask lying on the ground that appears weathered and ancient, and interacting with it provides no immediate response, but using the dream nail reveals memories or thoughts from whoever wore this mask. The fragments of thought suggest someone who was lost, who was searching for something, who eventually gave up or died in the darkness of Deepness, leaving only their mask behind. This small environmental detail is typical of Hollow Knight's environmental storytelling, where objects and locations tell stories without explicit narration, where players can piece together what happened to various characters based on where their possessions are found. The Weathered Mask might have belonged to an explorer or a warrior, or simply someone who got lost in Deepnest's maze-like passages and could never find their way out. Deepnest is full of such remains, skeletons and shells, and abandoned equipment, showing that many bugs met their end in these dark tunnels, far from anyone who might remember them. The mask as a specific object is significant because masks in Hollow Knight represent identity, and by extension, the person who wore this mask has been reduced to just that external shell, with no body, no spirit, just the face they showed the world, lying discarded in the darkness. Finding objects like this throughout Hallownest reminds players that the ghost is walking through what is essentially a massive tomb, that every area is filled with the remains of those who came before, and that the kingdom's history is written in these small personal tragedies as much as in its grand monuments. Gigi and Shade's summoning. In Dirtmouth there is a bug named Gigi, who offers a service of summoning the ghost Shade if the ghost has died and is unable to return to the location where it fell to reclaim its Geo and regain its full power. Gigi's ability to summon Shade suggests that she has some connection to death, or to the void, or to the spiritual realm that allows her to interact with these shadow forms. She charges a rancid egg for her service, showing that even death-related services have a cost in Hallownest's economy, and she performs her task without judgment, offering this help to anyone who needs it. Gigi's dialogue is minimal but friendly, and her presence in Dirtmouth adds to the sense that this surface town is a gathering place for unusual individuals who serve specific functions. The existence of shades themselves is interesting from a lore perspective, because when the ghost dies, it leaves behind a shadow form that contains all the geo it was carrying, and until that shade is defeated, the ghost is weakened, unable to gather soul as effectively. This mechanic suggests that death in Hallownest is not final, that consciousness, or at least some essence of self, persists in void form after death, and that this shade must be reintegrated before the ghost is whole again. For a vessel that is supposedly empty, the fact that it leaves behind a shade when it dies implies that it has developed something like a soul or spirit that can be separated from its body. This ties into the larger themes about vessels not being truly empty, about consciousness, developing even in beings designed to lack it, and about the void being more complex than simple emptiness or absence of thought. Seer's prophecy. The seer in the resting grounds is an ancient moth who maintains the dream nail and who speaks about the radiance in ways that suggest both worship and fear, both recognition of her power and understanding that she has become something twisted by anger and abandonment. The seer tasks the ghost with collecting essence dream energy that can be gathered from various sources, including ghosts and dream bosses, and as the ghost brings more essence, the seer reveals more about the moth tribe's history. She speaks about how the moths once worshipped the radiance, how they abandoned her for the Pale King's promises, how this abandonment led to the radiance's corruption into the vengeful god who caused the infection. The seer seems to carry guilt about this betrayal, even though she personally may have had little choice in the matter, and she sees the ghost's quest as a chance for redemption, or at least resolution. When the ghost collects enough essence, the seer gives it the awoken dream. Nail a more powerful version that can access deeper dreams and hidden memories, and she speaks of how the ghost is fulfilling an ancient prophecy or pattern. Eventually, if the ghost collects massive amounts of essence,